2,000 copies. Say it slowly. 2,000 copies. Not 200,000. Not 20,000. 2,000. For an album that was engineered to open at platinum. For a name that once moved units on reputation alone. For a release carrying an entire major label quarter on its back. 2,000 copies is not a debut. 2,000 copies is a funeral with a barcode on the casket. And here is the part that should make the back of your neck tighten up. The funeral was scheduled months in advance. Not in the studio. Not in the rollout meeting. Not on the timeline. The death of Set in Stone was penciled in across 5 phone calls in 5 cities between January and April of this year. 5 of the most bankable rappers walking the planet were asked to stand next to Rick Ross on this album. 5 of them passed. 5 different management teams. 5 different flavors of refusal. And buried inside every single refusal was the same 2-word phrase. Hold on to that. Because before this video ends, you are going to hear those 2 words spoken out loud, and the second they land, everything about this collapse stops looking like bad luck and starts looking like a controlled demolition. But first, let me show you the other universe. Because there is a version of this story, a version that came terrifyingly close to happening where Set in Stone opens at 200,000 copies. In that version, the January phone calls end with yes instead of no. In that version, 2 seismic guest verses anchor the tracklist, the pre-saves detonate on schedule, the playlist covers line up like dominoes, and Rick Ross spends the summer doing victory lap interviews instead of watching a spreadsheet bleed out in real time. That version was never a fantasy. That version was 90 days away. 90 days, and 1 filing cabinet. By the end of this video, you will know exactly which folder inside the filing cabinet did the killing. Let me be clear about what this is. No recap. This is not a reaction. This is an autopsy of the most expensive administrative mistake of Rick Ross's career, and the scalpel is a phrase 2 words long. Now, to understand why 5 superstars sprinted away from the biggest feature bag of the spring, you have to understand what a feature actually is right now. Forget music for a second. Forget bars. Forget chemistry. A feature on a major label rap album is not decoration. A feature is an insurance policy. Look at the architecture of every major label rap release of the last 10 years. 1 headline artist. 6 to 8 guest slots. 1 prestige name for radio. 1 younger name for the short video apps. 1 regional name for the touring markets. That is not a track list. That is a risk portfolio. Every guest verse on that list exists to guarantee a floor, a minimum threshold of pre-orders, playlist placements, and press coverage that no headline artist, not even one with Rick Ross's catalog, can manufacture alone. The feature is the load-bearing wall of the modern rap album. Which is why the first question out of any label executive's mouth, the very first one, is never, how does the album sound? It is, who is on the album? Songs can be fixed. Mixes can be redone. Rollouts can be rescheduled. But a feature list is concrete. Once the feature list hardens, the ceiling and the floor of the opening week are already written. Everybody inside the building knows this. Nobody outside the building talks about it. And that is exactly why, when the final Set in Stone tracklist was locked in June, the veterans went quiet. Because the features on the finished album are solid, competent, regionally diverse. Nobody is embarrassing themselves on those songs. But they are not the features anybody expected in January. In January, the whisper moving through the industry was that Rick Ross was about to open this album with 2 genuinely seismic guest verses. Verses from artists whose combined pre-save gravity alone would have shoved the opening week past 6 figures before breakfast on release day. Names that make playlist editors pick up the phone on the first ring. Neither of those artists is on the final track list. Neither of their labels ever explained why. And neither of them has ever publicly repeated the phrase that was reportedly handed to every one of them behind closed doors. 5 approaches. 5 rejections. 1 phrase. You are going to want to remember that ratio, because the ratio is the whole story. Now here is where I need you to lean in, Because what comes next is the part nobody puts on camera. The phrase did not travel through gossip channels. The phrase did not come from rival artists, from radio programmers, from bloggers, from fans with theories. The phrase came from inside the machinery, from a room most rap fans do not even know exists. And to follow the phrase back to its source, we have to leave the studio entirely and walk into a different building, a building where no music gets made at all, but where the fate of every album gets decided anyway. Stay with me. This is where the story stops being gossip and starts being a paper trail. Let me paint the room for you, because the room matters. Inside every major streaming platform, there is a small circle of talent relations executives. Not thousands of people. Not hundreds. A small circle. These are the people who curate the Tier 1 playlists. These are the people who decide whose new single opens the flagship editorial hub and whose new single gets a bullet point buried 4 pages deep. These are the people who determine whether Release Friday feels like a coronation or obituary. One swipe from that circle can be worth more than $1 million in marketing spend. Everybody in the industry knows the circle exists. Almost nobody outside the industry can name a single person in it. And that circle keeps files. Not official files. Nothing with a letterhead. Nothing a lawyer could subpoena and wave around a courtroom. Informal assessments, compiled continuously on every senior artist in the genre. Call them what the insiders call them, brand risk profiles. A brand risk profile is a living document, updated in real time, that measures one thing and one thing only. Not talent. Not catalog. Not cultural impact. Contamination potential. How dangerous is it, right now, this quarter, to stand next to this artist in public? If your brand risk profile reads clean, your feature requests get greenlit in an afternoon. One phone call. One email. Done. The verse shows up before the weekend. If your brand risk profile reads elevated because of a pending civil suit, a public feud generating fresh ammunition weekly, a documented pattern of financial trouble, your feature requests enter a process with a very polite name. Extended review? Write that phrase down. Extended review? Because extended review is the industry's way of saying no without ever saying no. No rejection letter. No awkward phone call. No burned bridge. Just silence, stretching across weeks, until the artist on the other end stops asking. It is the softest execution in the music business, and it is executed constantly, and almost nobody on the outside ever notices the bodies. Now, according to 3 separate sources across 3 separate label groups, extended review is exactly what swallowed 5 approach conversations between January and April. 5 approaches to 5 bankable rappers. 5 conversations that began normally, beats sent, numbers discussed, enthusiasm expressed. And then, one after another, all 5 conversations went quiet in precisely the same way. Not with a refusal. With a temperature drop. With a sudden formality. With the unmistakable signature of a file being opened somewhere, and a profile being read. And inside each of those 5 management teams, the same 2-word verdict was delivered to the artist. You already feel the shape of it, don't you? You have heard the phrase 1,000 times without ever hearing what it actually does. 2 words. The first word is brand. The second word is risk. Brand risk. That is the phrase. That is the executioner. In the modern label ecosystem, no 2 words carry more operational weight, and no 2 words are more thoroughly misunderstood by the audience. Because brand risk does not describe an artistic problem. Brand risk does not mean the music is weak. Brand risk describes a contamination problem. Brand risk means the people who control the pipes, the playlists, the covers, the editorial real estate, have decided that proximity to this artist carries a cost that proximity to other artists does not. And contamination is the single most frightening word in the vocabulary of any artist whose next contract is currently being negotiated. Think about what that means for the 5 rappers who got the call. Every one of those 5 has endorsement money on the table. Every one of those 5 has a renewal, an extension, or a new deal somewhere in the pipeline. A feature verse costs them 2 days in the studio. A contaminated brand profile could cost them 8 figures over 3 years. That is not a closed decision. That is not even a decision. That is arithmetic. And Rick Ross, according to the sources, was carrying a profile that had been quietly compiling for months. Here is where the story turns from industry gossip into something much colder. Because the brand risk profile attached to Rick Ross did not spring from one scandal. There was no single explosion, no viral moment, no arrest video. The profile was assembled, item by item, from a very specific list. And the list is the scariest part of this entire story, because every item on it is public, every item is verifiable, and every item, taken alone, looks like ordinary celebrity noise. Taken together, the items form something compliance officers have a name for. But we are not there yet. First you need to hear about the rejection that proves all of this is real. The one that slipped. The one where the machinery showed its hand for exactly 48 hours. Of the 5 rejections, 4 of them were clean. Professional. Invisible. A polite scheduling conflict here, a vague creative priorities answer there. If you were reading the email chains, you would see nothing. That is how extended review is designed to work. No fingerprints. But the 5th rejection was different. The 5th rejection is the one that tells you the January whispers were real, because the 5th rejection made a procedural mistake. And in this business, procedure is everything. Here is what happened. A Los Angeles-based artist, one of the biggest commercial names in the genre, was approached in the first wave of outreach. And the initial response from that camp was not hesitation. It was enthusiasm. Genuine enthusiasm. The team asked to hear the beats. Think about that for a second. You do not ask to hear the beats if you are planning to pass. You ask to hear the beats when you are already mentally writing the verse. The conversation had momentum. The conversation had a direction. By every normal industry standard, this feature was tracking toward a yes. Then 48 hours passed. And the withdrawal came. Now, pay attention to the detail, because the detail is the story. The withdrawal was not communicated by the artist's manager. It was not communicated by the artist's agent. It was not communicated by the label contact, who had been running the conversation from the start. The withdrawal was communicated by the artist's brand attorney. Stop. Run that back. A brand attorney. In a feature negotiation, that does not happen. Feature talks are manager territory, maybe agent territory, occasionally label executive territory. Lawyers appear at the contract stage, after the creative handshake, to paper the deal already agreed. A brand attorney does not appear in feature negotiations for the same reason a fire marshal does not appear at a birthday party. The presence of the specialist is the announcement of the emergency. A brand attorney shows up in exactly one scenario, when an artist's endorsement pipeline is being protected from a specific, identified contamination threat. That one procedural anomaly confirms everything. It tells you the artist's side did not make a creative decision. It tells you somebody in that camp ran a risk assessment, did not like the output, and escalated the file to the one person whose entire job is keeping the artist's name away from contaminated associations. The enthusiasm was real. The interest in the beats was real. And the profile won anyway. The profile always wins. And if the Los Angeles conversation went like that, with enthusiasm collapsing inside 2 days, under legal escalation, imagine what the other 4 conversations looked like from the inside. Imagine being one of those 5 artists. You get the call. The bag is real. The record has history behind it. And then your own management sits you down and says 2 words, and the conversation is over, and nobody ever speaks about it publicly, because speaking about it publicly would itself be a brand risk event. 5 rappers. 5 versions of the same silence. So now the question becomes unavoidable. What was on the profile? What could possibly be sitting in a file that is radioactive enough to vaporize 5 8-figure adjacent conversations in a single quarter? According to a source with access to a brand relations dashboard used by 2 of the streaming platforms, the profile attached to Rick Ross was compiled from a specific list of items. I am going to read the list to you slowly, because the power of the list is not in any single entry. The power is in the stack. Item 1. A pending property tax execution. Not a rumor. Not a blog post. An execution, meaning the matter had moved past dispute and past delinquency into the enforcement stage, the stage where documents start carrying case numbers and deadlines. Item 2. A Department of Labor fine attached to a franchise operation. Again, not gossip. A regulatory action on the record tied to a business carrying the artist's name. Item 3. A civil complaint from a car show attendee. Small on its own. The kind of thing that settles quietly 100 times a year. On its own. Item 4. A public feud actively generating litigable content. Not an old beef. Not nostalgia. A live conflict producing fresh, quotable, potentially actionable material on a rolling basis. Item 5. An ongoing pattern of deleted social media posts, flagged by a media monitoring vendor. Read that one twice. There is a vendor. There is a monitoring system. The deletions are being logged. Now here is what matters. Every single item on that list is public. Every single item is verifiable. And every single item, individually, could have been managed, settled, resolved, or explained. Any one of those 5 items, alone on a profile, slows nothing down. Executives see single item flags every week. Singles get waved through. But 5 items. On one profile. At the same moment. That configuration has a name inside the compliance world. It is called a vector cluster. A vector cluster is the specific arrangement of risk factors that triggers an automatic elevation in the review process. Automatic. Meaning no human being in that circle made a judgment call about Rick Ross. No executive weighed loyalty, or history, or catalog. The configuration itself tripped the wire. Once a vector cluster registers, the elevation is mechanical, and every downstream process, including feature approvals, moves from the artistic level to the legal level. And no rapper's legal team ever approves a feature when the compliance vector is elevated. Not for friendship. Not for history. Not for any bag. Now I want to walk you into the alternate universe, because this is the part of the story that should genuinely make you angry. Everything you just heard, the tax execution, the labor fine, the civil complaint, the feud content, the deletion log, none of it was unsolvable. None of it. A property tax execution gets resolved with a payment and a filing. A labor fine gets resolved with a payment and a filing. A civil complaint from a car show attendee gets settled for a number that would not register as a rounding error on this album's marketing budget. These were not terminal problems. These were errands. And the timeline makes it worse. The January outreach, the outreach that opened the 5 conversations, began while the profile was already compiling but before the cluster fully tripped. Which means there was a window. A real, concrete, calendar-marked window in which the entire catastrophe was optional. What if the album had been delayed by 90 days? Sit with that. Not a year. 90 days. What if the tax execution had been resolved in December, before the January calls ever went out? What if the property-related items had been quietly settled over the holidays, the way 1,000 other celebrity obligations get quietly settled every single year, while the profile was still a collection of singles instead of a cluster? What if somebody whose job was to watch that dashboard, somebody whose entire function was keeping the file clean, had simply done the job? In that universe, the 5 conversations do not hit extended review. The Los Angeles artist's enthusiasm survives past 48 hours, because there is no profile elevation for the brand attorney to react to, because the brand attorney never enters the conversation at all. The 2 seismic January features stay on the board. The pre-save gravity they carry pushes the opening week past 6 figures on schedule. And Set in Stone does not open at 2,000 copies. Set in Stone opens at 200,000 copies, and the entire summer narrative, every joke, every meme, every victory lap from every rival, never gets written. 198,000 copies of difference. And the price of that difference was not a better single, or a bigger marketing budget, or a smarter rollout. The price of that difference was a filing cabinet, a payment, a settlement, a December instead of a spring. The most expensive mistake of Rick Ross's career was not made in the studio. It was not made on stage. It was not made on a podcast microphone, though the microphones did not help. It was made in the filing cabinet, in the space between what the paperwork demanded and what anybody bothered to do about it. The album did not underperform. The administration underperformed, and the album took the bullet. And here is the detail that turns this from a business story into a tragedy of timing. The label already knew. Labels do not wait for opening week numbers to read a feature list. The moment the June track list locked without the January names, the people upstairs could model the floor and the ceiling to within a few thousand units. 2,000 copies was not a surprise to the building. 2,000 copies was a forecast that came true. Which is why the label's response has been so quiet, so fast, and so revealing. Because the label has already moved on. Not publicly. Publicly, the machine still runs the motions, the posts, the playlists, the appearances. But internally, according to the same sources, the flagship has been quietly reclassified, and the operation now running around, set in stone, is not a salvage operation. It is something the majors have a specific playbook for, and the name of that playbook tells you everything about how the building really sees this album. It is called damage limit marketing. Damage limit marketing is the protocol a major label runs when a flagship release underperforms beyond recovery, and the priority shifts from saving the record to protecting the artist's next deal cycle. Under this playbook, the current album stops being an asset and starts being a containment zone. Marketing spend gets capped. No new singles get pushed. Press opportunities get triaged, with anything that might generate questions about the numbers quietly declined. The goal is no longer to sell. Set in stone. The goal is to make sure. Set in stone is forgotten on a schedule that does not contaminate the negotiation that comes next. Read that again. The label is not trying to save the album. The label is trying to make sure the album dies on a timeline that protects the next contract. That is where Rick Ross's flagship release lives right now. Inside a containment zone. Managed not for growth, but for decay rate. And meanwhile, the 5 rappers who said no are doing something much more interesting than moving on. They are watching. Let me slow down and walk through the 5 items one at a time, because the list deserves a proper autopsy, and because each item teaches you something about how the machine actually reads an artist. Item 1. The property tax execution. Understand what the word execution signals to a compliance reader. A tax bill is an errand. A tax dispute is a negotiation. A tax execution is an escalation, a public declaration that the informal phase ended and the enforcement phase began, that notices were sent, deadlines were missed, and the matter now lives inside a legal process with dates and dockets attached. To a fan, a tax execution is a headline that scrolls past in an afternoon. To a brand relations executive, a tax execution is evidence of a specific behavior pattern, obligations accumulating until an outside force compels resolution. One item like that is a yellow flag. It becomes something darker only in combination, and the combination is coming. Item 2. The Department of Labor fine on the franchise operation. On the surface, this is a business story, not a music story, and that is exactly the point. The franchise carries the artist's name. The artist's name is the product being risk assessed. A labor fine says the machine behind the name is being run in a way that attracts regulatory attention, and regulatory attention is contagious inside a risk model. One regulator's file invites another regulator's curiosity, and the executives reading the profile know it. Again, a loan, survivable. A fine gets paid, a process gets fixed, the story dies. But the profile is not counting dollars. The profile is counting directions. Every item is an arrow, and the arrows are starting to point the same way. Item 3. The civil complaint from the car show attendee. This is the smallest item on the list and, in a strange way, the most revealing. Because the question a risk analyst asks about a minor civil complaint is never, how much will this cost? The question is, why does this exist at all? Artists at this level are surrounded by people whose job is absorbing friction before friction becomes paperwork. When a small grievance travels all the way to a filed complaint, it means the absorption layer failed, and a failed absorption layer is itself data. It suggests the operational discipline around the artist is gaps, and gaps are where clusters grow. Item 4. The public feud generating litigable content. This one the audience knows well, because the audience has been watching it in real time. But the audience reads a feud as entertainment, and the profile reads a feud as a production schedule. Every new post, every new clip, every new caption is fresh material that opposing counsel, bloggers, and rival camps can mine. A feud that produces content weekly is a feud that produces risk weekly, and risk that renews itself on a schedule is the worst kind of risk to stand next to, because no one can model where it goes next. When the Los Angeles artist's brand attorney looked at the profile, this is the item that had no ceiling. Everything else had a number attached. This one had a question mark. Item 5. The deleted post pattern, flagged by a media monitoring vendor. Fully absorb what this item implies, because it changes how you see the other 4. There are vendors, real companies with real contracts, whose entire business is watching the social accounts of major artists and logging what disappears. Deletions get flagged because deletions are behavior. A deleted post is a decision made twice, once to publish, once to retract. A pattern of deletions reads, to a risk model, as a pattern of impulse followed by damage control, and impulse followed by damage control is the single most predictive signature of future contamination events. The vendor does not editorialize. The vendor logs. The log feeds the dashboard. The dashboard feeds the profile. The profile feeds the circle. And the circle decides whose release Friday looks like a coronation. Now stack them. Tax enforcement pointing at financial discipline. A labor fine pointing at operational discipline. A minor complaint pointing at a failing buffer layer. A live feud pointing at unbounded legal exposure. A deletion log pointing at impulse and retraction. 5 arrows, 5 different parts of the operation, all pointing at the same conclusion, all active in the same quarter. That is the vector cluster. That is what 5 management teams saw between January and April. And that is why the 2 most important words in this entire story are not brand and risk. They are same time. And this part of the autopsy I hand directly to you, because once you understand the cluster, you never look at a track list the same way again. From now on, every rap album announcement is a document you read like an analyst. When a major artist unveils a feature list, you are not looking at songs. You are looking at a real-time printout of the artist's brand risk profile, rendered in names. A track list stacked with first call, top-tier features is a clean profile made visible. A track list where expected names were swapped for safer, smaller, regional ones is an elevated profile made visible. The June tracklist for Set in Stone was not a creative document. The June tracklist was a risk disclosure, published in plain sight, and almost nobody in the audience knew how to read it. The missing features tell you more than the present ones. The absence is the data. Learn the 3 signatures. Signature 1. The downgrade swap, when a whispered A-list name quietly becomes a solid but lower gravity name on the final list. Signature 2. The timing gap, when announcement and feature reveals drift weeks further apart than the rollout implied, because delayed reveals are extended review working through the pipeline in real time. Signature 3. The lawyer's silence, when artists publicly enthusiastic about a collaboration suddenly stop mentioning it, because enthusiasm that vanishes without a denial is enthusiasm that met a brand attorney. You have seen all 3 signatures 100 times. You never had the vocabulary. Now you do. That vocabulary is why the 5 rejections stayed invisible for months. The audience watched the music while the entire story sat printed in the guest list. Apply it backward and the spring snaps into focus. January whispered 2 seismic verses. June contained neither. Between those points sit the vector cluster, the 5 calls, the Los Angeles attorney, the 2 words. The audience experienced the gap as mystery. The industry experienced it as confirmation. 2,000 copies was simply the moment the audience received the information the tracklist had carried since June. That is why this story matters beyond one artist, one album. The dashboards are not going away. The vendors are not going away. The circle is not going away. Every major rap release from now on passes through the same machinery and publishes its own risk disclosure, in names, in absences, in timing gaps, weeks before the numbers make it official. The fans who learn to read those disclosures will always be ahead of the story. Everyone else will keep being surprised by funerals that were scheduled months in advance. So let us talk about the watchers, because the watchers are where this story goes next. The 5 rappers who said no did not say no and forget. That is not how this level of the business works. Every one of those 5 is a strategic actor with a management team that reads the same dashboards, hears from the same circle, and tracks the same profiles. When those 5 teams delivered the phrase brand risk to their artists, each of them also opened a file of their own. A watch file. Because a brand risk profile is not a verdict carved in granite. A brand risk profile is a weather system, and weather systems move. Here is the calculation each of those 5 camps is running right now, and it is colder than any diss track. They are watching the Rick Ross profile for movement in either direction. If the tax execution resolves, if the labor matter closes, if the complaint settles, if the feud exhausts itself, if the deletion log goes quiet, then the cluster degrades, item by item, back into singles. Singles get waved through. And the moment the profile drops back below the cluster threshold, the exact same 5 artists who sprinted away in the spring become available again, because proximity is no longer contamination, it is opportunity. And some of them will want to be first back through the door, because being the feature that announces the comeback is its own kind of leverage. But the other direction is the direction that ends careers. Because if the profile does not degrade, if new items attach faster than old items resolve, then the artist keeps climbing what compliance people informally call the vector cluster ladder. And the ladder has levels. At the level Rick Ross occupied in the spring, the cost was features, 5 conversations, 5 refusals, a 2,000 copy opening. The next level up is playlist access, the Tier 1 editorial real estate quietly drying up, the flagship hub placement replaced by the page 4 bullet point. The level above that is partnership flow, the brands, the renewals, the endorsement pipeline that the Los Angeles artist's attorney was so desperate to protect, because contamination is symmetric and whatever the circle sees in one profile, the circle assumes about anyone standing close to it. Nobody publishes the latter. Everybody in the business knows the rungs. And this is the sentence the whole story was built to deliver. Features are a trailing indicator. Say it plainly. By the time the features disappear, the condition that removed them has been present for months. The 5 rejections did not cause the 2,000 copy opening. The 5 rejections were a symptom, the first visible symptom, of a profile that had been compiling since before the first January phone call. The audience saw a flop arrive out of nowhere in the summer. The machinery saw a forecast confirm itself on schedule. Nothing about this collapse was sudden. Only the visibility of it was sudden. That is what trailing indicators do. They announce endings that already happened. And that is why the 5 watchers are so much more important than the 5 rejections, because the watchers are reading the leading indicators now, the resolutions and the non-resolutions, the quiet settlements and the loud new posts, and every one of them is computing the same 6-month question: is the profile coming back down the ladder, or still climbing it? The answer to that question decides whether the next Rick Ross album gets its January features or spends its rollout inside another containment zone. The answer is being written right now, in filing cabinets and settlement conferences, in deletions and dashboard logs, in rooms with no music playing at all. Now let me reconstruct the 5 phone calls, because each one died a slightly different death, and the differences matter. Call 1. The prestige feature. The radio anchor. The conversation with the most history behind it, the relationship that predated the dashboards, the monitoring vendors, the very concept of a brand risk profile. And it ended the fastest. Because the longest histories carry the largest endorsement books, and the largest endorsement books carry the most conservative attorneys. The team did not even wait for the beats. The response came back warm, personal, full of respect for everything Rick Ross built, and completely empty of a date. When a yes is coming, the answer includes a calendar. When extended review has done its work, the answer includes compliments. Count the compliments. There were many. Call 2. The younger feature. The short video rocket. This one almost survived, because younger artists run hotter risk tolerances. The conversation stretched across weeks. Numbers were discussed. A concept was floated. And then the camp asked one question that ended everything. Not about money, not about splits, but about placement. Where on the album would the verse sit, and who else would be confirmed by then? That question is a risk question wearing a creative costume. The artist was not asking about sequencing. The artist was asking who else had said yes, because in a contamination assessment, the guest list is the dataset. When the honest answer was that the guest list was still forming, the conversation cooled within days. Nobody wants to be the first confirmed name on a contaminated track list. Somebody has to go first, and everybody at that level knows why nobody volunteered. Call 3. The regional feature. The Turing piece. The quietest death of the 5. No attorney. No escalation. Just a team that ran the dashboard math internally, concluded the verse was not worth the exposure, and let the thread go idle. This is the death the system is designed to produce. Frictionless, faceless, deniable. No one said no. The calendar simply never opened. Call 4. The veteran. The peer. This one carried a personal cost, because the relationship was real, and the refusal reportedly came with a private explanation that was almost tender in its honesty. The message, paraphrased through 2 hands, was essentially this: the door is not closed, the door is paused, and the pause has a name, and the name is 2 words long. Fix the file, and call again. Of all 5 rejections, this is the one that tells you the phrase was spoken explicitly, verbatim, artist to management, because that is the only way a refusal arrives with instructions attached. And call 5. Los Angeles. You already know that story. Enthusiasm, beats requested, 48 hours, brand attorney. The only rejection in the set where the machinery showed its hand. 5 calls. 5 architectures of no. A compliment wall, a guest list probe, a silent calendar, a tender warning, a legal escalation. 5 management teams, 5 house styles, 1 identical input, a profile with 5 arrows pointing the same direction at the same time. That is what a vector cluster does. The cluster does not argue with artists. The cluster does not persuade managers. The cluster simply exists, and the market reorganizes itself around the cluster the way traffic reorganizes around an accident nobody wants to look at directly. And here is the uncomfortable question that separates the casual viewer from the person who actually understands what happened this spring. If the phrase was delivered 5 times in 5 rooms, by 5 teams who do not talk to each other, who coordinated the consistency? Nobody. That is the answer, and it should unsettle you. No memo went out. No blacklist circulated. The consistency is the product of the dashboard itself. 5 teams reading the same risk signals from the same small circle and arriving at the same 2 words independently. The system does not need to conspire. The system only needs to share a file. So where does this leave Rick Ross right now today? Inside a containment zone, with a flagship managed for decay rate, with a label protecting the next negotiation instead of the current record, and with 5 of the most powerful names in the genre watching the Rick Ross dashboard like investors watching a stock they have not yet decided to short. The 2,000 copies are history. History cannot be renegotiated. But the profile is not history. The profile is alive, updating, moving, and the next 6 months of that movement will decide whether set in stone was an accident or an announcement. Remember what the alternate universe taught us. Every item was an errand. The tax execution is an errand. The labor fine is an errand. The complaint is an errand. Errands can be run. The feud can go quiet. Feuds exhaust themselves when one side stops feeding the meter. The deletion log can go flat. 30 days of disciplined posting reads to a monitoring vendor like a change pattern. The cluster is not a sentence. The cluster is a scoreboard, and scores change in both directions. And somewhere in the building around Rick Ross, somebody is finally running the errands, because everybody now understands the price of leaving them on the desk. That is the comeback path, and it is boring, and that is why it might work. Compliance redemption does not trend. Settlements do not get clipped. 90 quiet days of a clean dashboard will never make a single headline. And yet, 90 quiet days is the entire distance between the universe where the 5 calls fail and the universe where the 5 calls succeed. The most important verse of Rick Ross's career might turn out to be a verse nobody ever hears. The paperwork verse, the December verse, the one recorded in a filing cabinet instead of a booth. But the watchers will not wait forever. Features are a trailing indicator, and the trailing indicator has a mirror image. The first artist who says yes again. When the profile degrades below the cluster threshold, somebody from that original 5, or somebody watching from just outside it, will take the call, and that single yes will be read by the entire industry as the all-clear signal. One yes reopens the market. One yes restarts the pre-save math. One yes turns the containment zone back into a rollout. Everything between this moment and that yes is the actual story of the next Rick Ross album, and it will be written long before a single bar is. Now you have the whole architecture. The phrase was brand risk. The mechanism was a vector cluster. The trigger was 5 public, verifiable, solvable items stacked in 1 quarter. The cost was 5 features, a platinum ceiling, and 198,000 copies of opening week Gravity. The bill was paid not in the studio, but in the filing cabinet. And the next chapter is being decided right now, in settlement conferences and dashboard logs, while 5 of the biggest names in rap watch the ladder and wait. Which brings us to the question this story has circled since the first frame. 5 rappers were approached between January and April. 5 rappers heard the same 2 words from 5 different management teams. 5 rappers walked away from the biggest feature bag of the spring, and not one of them has ever said the phrase out loud in public. So tell me, which 5 rappers do you think turned it down? Drop your top 3 in the comments. Read the other guesses before you post yours, because some of the answers already down there are closer to the dashboard than you would believe. And subscribe, because in the next installment, we are naming names. The 5 conversations, the 5 teams, the Los Angeles attorney, and the 1 refusal that came with instructions attached. The filing cabinet is open now. The folder has a name on it. And next time, so do the 5. 2,000 copies was never the story. The story was always the 90 days, the 5 arrows, the 2 words nobody would say on camera. Now you have heard the 2 words. You will hear them differently everywhere, in every rollout, in every quiet track list, in every feature that never materializes, for the rest of your life as a fan of this music. The album was set in stone. Nothing else was.